"Sir, that seat isn't yours." The words floated across the glittering ballroom with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the room already belonged to him. Crystal chandeliers bathed the Grand Lexington Hotel in warm golden light as a string quartet filled the air with soft music. Yet every nearby conversation faded the moment Ethan Whitmore rested his hand on the back of a chair marked with a single elegant name card. Across the polished marble floor, Marcus Ellington had just reached the table after checking his coat with the attendants. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored but understated. His polished shoes carried the faint shine of someone who cared about details rather than attention, and his calm eyes drifted toward the reserved seat without the slightest hint of urgency. Before Marcus could speak, Ethan slid into the chair with a satisfied grin while his wife, Victoria, plucked the name card from the table between two perfectly manicured fingers. She glanced at it for barely a second before letting it flutter carelessly onto the white tablecloth. "There," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. Problem solved. A few guests exchanged awkward looks, while others simply pretended not to notice. Charity galas attracted generous hearts on paper, but social status still ruled many conversations. Marcus bent down, picked up the folded card without a trace of irritation, brushed away an invisible speck of dust, and looked at Ethan with quiet composure. "I believe this seat was reserved," he said politely. Ethan leaned back, crossing one leg over the other as though the conversation itself amused him. "Reserved for someone important," he replied. "I'm sure you'll find another place." Victoria chuckled softly before adding, "The staff entrance is around the corner if you're looking for directions." A ripple of restrained laughter drifted through the nearby tables. No one laughed loudly enough to appear cruel, yet no one interrupted either. Marcus looked around the ballroom for a long moment. Hundreds of flickering candles reflected against towering windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays, and wealthy donors chatted beneath banners celebrating generosity and leadership. Ironically, compassion seemed to disappear the instant it became inconvenient. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly woman standing nearby struggled to pull back a heavy chair. Without saying another word about his own situation, Marcus stepped away from the reserved table, gently pulled out the chair for her, waited until she was comfortably seated, and wished her a pleasant evening. The woman smiled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, young man." Marcus nodded. "You're very welcome, ma'am." Ethan watched the exchange with a dismissive smirk. "See," he whispered to Victoria. "He finally found the right job." They laughed quietly together. Marcus heard every word, yet his expression never changed. Instead, he walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows at the edge of the ballroom and stood silently, hands loosely folded in front of him as the city lights shimmered beyond the glass like thousands of distant stars. He checked neither his phone nor his watch. He simply waited. Across the room, a nervous event coordinator glanced repeatedly toward the grand entrance before whispering into her headset, "Mr. Coleman just arrived." Within seconds, the ballroom doors began to open. The music faded naturally as conversations dissolved into curious whispers. Richard Coleman stepped through the towering ballroom doors with the effortless confidence of a man who had built industries instead of simply investing in them. His silver hair caught the warm chandelier light, and the room instinctively shifted toward him. Executives straightened their jackets. Donors lifted their glasses. Cameras quietly turned in his direction. Yet Richard acknowledged almost no one. His eyes moved slowly across the ballroom as though searching for a familiar face rather than admiring the lavish evening he had sponsored. Beside him, his chief of staff, Olivia Bennett, reviewed the schedule on a digital tablet. "The opening remarks begin in 5 minutes," she said softly. Richard barely nodded. "Not until everyone who matters is here." Olivia looked slightly puzzled. "Most of the board has already arrived." Richard smiled faintly. "I was not referring to the board." Across the ballroom, Marcus remained beside the glass windows, watching the lights of downtown Chicago sparkle against the calm waters of the river below. The reflection of the city stretched endlessly across the glass, almost blending his silhouette into the skyline itself. He appeared completely unbothered by everything that had happened only moments earlier. His breathing remained slow. His posture never changed. Years earlier, situations like this would have filled him with frustration. Experience had taught him something far more valuable than anger. Character always revealed itself before opportunity did. Near the reserved table, Ethan Whitmore adjusted his tie with growing confidence. Several nearby guests recognized him as the founder of Whitmore Urban Development, a company aggressively pursuing one of the largest redevelopment contracts in Illinois. Tonight was more than another charity event for him. It was the evening he hoped would secure the investment capable of transforming his company into a national brand. Victoria leaned closer and whispered with satisfaction, "You handled that perfectly. People have to know where they belong." Ethan glanced toward Marcus, still standing quietly near the windows. "Confidence wins rooms like this," he replied. "Nobody questions the person who acts like he belongs." Neither of them noticed that Olivia Bennett had quietly followed Richard's gaze across the ballroom. Her eyes landed on Marcus almost instantly. "Sir," she said carefully, "I believe he is over there." Richard looked toward the windows and immediately recognized the familiar figure. His serious expression softened into genuine relief. "Finally," he whispered. "I was beginning to think traffic had delayed him." Before taking another step, Richard stopped beside the event coordinator. "Has Mr. Ellington been welcomed properly?" The young coordinator hesitated. She checked her guest list once, then twice. Her confident smile slowly disappeared. I assumed someone else had greeted him." Richard's eyebrows lowered slightly. "Assumed." The single word carried no anger, yet. It immediately tightened the atmosphere around everyone standing nearby. The coordinator suddenly noticed the empty, reserved chair across the ballroom. The personalized place card was no longer standing upright where it had been carefully placed earlier that afternoon. She quietly followed Richard's line of sight toward Marcus, then toward Ethan sitting comfortably in the reserved seat, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Even the string quartet seemed to lose its rhythm for a brief moment as Richard adjusted his jacket and began walking directly across the ballroom, not toward the stage where everyone expected him to begin the evening, but toward the quiet man standing alone by the windows. Richard Coleman crossed the ballroom without acknowledging the applause that usually followed his entrance. Every polished dress, shoes striking the marble floor, seemed to quiet another conversation until the only sounds left were the distant violins and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. Guests instinctively stepped aside, assuming he was making his way toward the stage. Instead, he walked directly past the head table, past several prominent donors, and stopped only a few feet from Marcus Ellington. Marcus turned from the window with the same composed expression he had worn all evening. Before he could speak, Richard extended his hand with unmistakable warmth. "Marcus, I am relieved you made it. I was beginning to think Chicago traffic had defeated even you." Marcus smiled politely and accepted the handshake. "I would not miss your event, Richard." Nearby guests exchanged puzzled glances. Ethan watched the interaction with growing confusion, still comfortably seated where he believed he belonged. Victoria leaned closer and whispered, "Who is that man?" Ethan shrugged with forced confidence. "Probably an old consultant." Richard noticed the uncertainty spreading across the room. His eyes briefly drifted toward the reserved table, then toward the folded place card still resting in Marcus's hand. "Why are you standing?" he asked quietly. Marcus answered with complete honesty. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding about the seating arrangement." Richard looked toward the head table once more. His expression remained calm, yet something in his eyes caused Olivia Bennett to immediately understand that the evening had just taken an unexpected turn. She followed his gaze and quickly spotted Ethan occupying the reserved chair. Her heartbeat quickened. Earlier that afternoon, she had personally supervised every seating assignment because tonight's arrangements had been more than ceremonial. Every position around the head table reflected months of planning, especially the chair reserved for the guest whose decision could determine the future of several companies present that evening. Richard accepted the place card from Marcus with remarkable care, smoothing its edges between his fingers before reading the embossed lettering once again. He did not need to read it. He already knew exactly whose name was written there. Around the ballroom, whispers multiplied. Several executives quietly searched Marcus's face, trying to place where they might have seen him before. One older banker suddenly frowned as though an old memory had returned. Another investor discreetly opened his phone beneath the table and began searching for photographs from recent financial conferences. Across the room, Ethan finally stood, forcing an uneasy smile as Richard approached the reserved table. "Mr. Coleman," he said confidently, extending his own hand. "It is an honor to finally meet you." Richard acknowledged the greeting with a brief nod, but did not shake his hand. Instead, he gently lifted the chair away from the table and placed the personalized card back in its original position. The elegant lettering reflected beneath the chandelier lights. Marcus Ellington. Silence spread faster than any announcement ever could. Victoria stared at the card, then at Marcus, struggling to understand why one simple name had suddenly changed the atmosphere of an entire ballroom. Ethan's confident posture slowly stiffened. For the first time that evening, he realized every person in the room had stopped watching Richard Coleman. They were all watching Marcus. Richard waited until Marcus reached the table before placing one hand lightly against the back of the restored chair. There was nothing theatrical about the gesture. It was quiet, deliberate, and respectful, the kind of courtesy that carried more weight than a speech. "Your seat has been waiting for you all evening," Richard said warmly. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before replying. "Thank you, Richard, but I would rather everyone remain comfortable." Richard smiled. "That is exactly why this seat belongs to you." Marcus finally took his place while the ballroom remained wrapped in complete silence. Ethan stepped backward almost instinctively, his confidence slipping beneath the growing pressure of hundreds of curious eyes. Victoria forced a nervous laugh that nobody joined. She glanced from one guest to another, searching for reassurance, but every familiar face now seemed more interested in Marcus than in her. Olivia Bennett quietly approached Richard and handed him a leather portfolio containing the evening program. Richard closed it without opening a single page. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom without raising its volume. "Our program will begin shortly, but first I would like to correct an unfortunate misunderstanding." No one reached for a drink. No one whispered. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Richard continued, "Tonight is not simply a fundraising gala. It is also the final review meeting for the Coleman Community Growth Initiative, a $500 million investment program supporting projects that strengthen neighborhoods across the country." Several executives immediately exchanged uneasy looks. They had assumed the investment decisions had already been made behind closed doors. Richard slowly turned toward Marcus. "Every proposal submitted this year has already been carefully analyzed. Financial projections, long-term sustainability, ethical leadership, employee development, and community impact have all been reviewed." Marcus listened quietly, his hands resting calmly on the table. Richard smiled again before adding, "There was only one person whose recommendation I trusted enough to make the final decision." A wave of realization slowly spread through the ballroom. The older banker who had been studying Marcus suddenly whispered, "Ellington Capital." Another executive looked up from his phone with widened eyes. "That cannot be the same Marcus Ellington." A third guest quietly searched the financial news archives and found a recent article featuring a photograph taken at an international investment conference in New York. The image matched perfectly. The calm man sitting at the head table had spent years avoiding magazine covers, television interviews, and social media, preferring results over recognition. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. He had studied reports from Ellington Capital for nearly 3 years. He had quoted Marcus's investment philosophy during board meetings without ever knowing what the man actually looked like. His company's proposal had survived every preliminary review because analysts believed it fit Marcus's disciplined approach to sustainable development. Now memories collided painfully inside his mind. The reserved chair, the quiet confidence, the refusal to argue, the simple act of helping an elderly guest instead of defending his own pride. Ethan slowly looked down at his hands. Victoria finally whispered, almost unable to hear her own voice, "Ethan, is that really him?" Before Ethan could answer, Richard placed one hand gently on Marcus's shoulder and looked across the room with calm certainty. "There is one final decision still waiting to be announced tonight, and only one person in this ballroom has the authority to make it." The ballroom remained perfectly still as Richard stepped away from the microphone and turned toward Marcus with quiet respect. "Marcus," he said, "the decision belongs to you." Hundreds of eyes immediately shifted to the man who had spent most of the evening standing alone beside a window without demanding attention from anyone. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked slowly around the room. He saw executives who suddenly smiled as though they had known him for years. He noticed guests lowering their eyes after realizing they had laughed only minutes earlier. He even recognized the elderly woman he had helped, who now returned his smile with sincere gratitude. Finally, his gaze settled on Ethan and Victoria. Neither of them could hold eye contact for more than a second. Ethan cleared his throat before stepping forward. "Mr. Ellington," he began carefully, "I owe you an apology. I made an assumption that I should never have made." His voice no longer carried the confidence that had filled the ballroom earlier that evening. It sounded smaller now, weighed down by the realization that reputation could disappear much faster than it was built. Victoria nodded quickly. "We were wrong. We did not know who you were." Marcus listened without interruption. Then he answered with the same calm tone he had used from the beginning of the evening. "You are correct. You did not know who I was." A brief silence settled over the room before he continued. "But that was never the real problem." Ethan lowered his eyes. Marcus folded his hands lightly on the table. Respect should never depend on someone's name, title, appearance, or the value of their portfolio. If kindness only appears after success is revealed, then it is not kindness. It is calculation. No one moved. Even the photographers standing along the walls lowered their cameras. Richard quietly smiled, not because Marcus had embarrassed anyone, but because he had chosen principle over revenge. Marcus slowly stood from the reserved chair and walked toward Ethan until only a few feet separated them. His voice remained gentle enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. "Earlier tonight, you believed confidence meant acting as though every room belonged to you." Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. "Real confidence," Marcus continued, "is making every person feel welcome, even when you have every reason to believe they have nothing to offer you." The words settled over the ballroom with more force than any accusation could have carried. Olivia Bennett glanced around the room and noticed several executives quietly reflecting on their own behavior. One donor reached across the table to introduce himself to a guest he had ignored all evening. Another thanked a waiter by name before accepting a fresh glass of water. The atmosphere itself seemed to soften. Marcus returned to the head table and looked toward Richard. "You asked me to evaluate leadership, ethics, and long-term vision. Financial statements can be corrected. Business strategies can improve. Character is far more difficult to rebuild." Richard gave a thoughtful nod. "Then I believe everyone here understands the weight of the decision that remains." Ethan looked at Marcus with genuine uncertainty. For the first time in years, the future of his company depended not on numbers, contracts, or presentations, but on whether the values he claimed to represent could still earn another person's trust. For several long seconds, Marcus said nothing. The silence felt heavier than any speech delivered that evening. Beyond the towering windows, the lights of Chicago shimmered across the river, reflecting softly against the polished marble floor like quiet reminders that even the brightest skylines were built one light at a time. Marcus looked down at the leather folder resting on the table before him. Inside were months of financial analysis, community impact reports, engineering assessments, and recommendations prepared by dozens of professionals. Every proposal had been measured against the same standards. Profit mattered, but never without integrity. Richard remained completely still, allowing Marcus the space to think without interruption. Around the ballroom, people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Earlier, many had been eager to witness a dramatic confrontation. Instead, they found themselves watching something much more difficult. A man choosing wisdom over emotion. Ethan stood quietly, his shoulders no longer squared with confidence, but lowered beneath the weight of honest reflection. He replayed the evening inside his mind. Marcus had never raised his voice. He had never demanded recognition. He had never reminded anyone of his accomplishments. The only thing Marcus had insisted upon was dignity, and even then, he had done so without anger. Victoria slowly reached for Ethan's hand beneath the table. Neither of them spoke. For the first time since entering the ballroom, appearances no longer seemed important. Across the room, several conversations quietly resumed, but they sounded different now. Guests introduced themselves to strangers they had overlooked earlier. A senior executive stood to thank one of the event volunteers who had been clearing tables all evening. A waiter who had remained nearly invisible throughout the gala suddenly found himself receiving warm smiles instead of hurried gestures. The atmosphere had shifted in a way that no amount of expensive decoration could have accomplished. Marcus finally opened the leather folder. He carefully reviewed one page, then another, before closing it once again. Richard studied him with patient confidence. He had worked alongside Marcus for nearly a decade and knew that the longest pauses usually led to the most thoughtful decisions. Marcus slowly stood and walked toward the ballroom windows once more. His reflection appeared beside the glittering skyline, reminding him of a lesson his late father had repeated throughout his childhood. People will always remember how you made them feel long after they forget what you gave them. He smiled faintly at the memory. Success had brought him opportunities beyond anything his family had imagined, but it had never changed the values they built around the kitchen table in a small brick house on the south side of Chicago. Those values had followed him into every boardroom, every negotiation, and every investment decision. He turned back toward the guests. Every company represented here has talented people, he said calmly. Every proposal has strengths. But capital should never reward growth if character is left behind. His words settled gently across the room. No one appeared offended because everyone understood he was speaking from conviction rather than pride. Richard folded his hands and nodded almost imperceptibly. Olivia Bennet quietly closed her tablet, realizing that the carefully prepared presentation would no longer define the evening. The lesson unfolding before everyone had become far more valuable than charts or financial projections. Ethan lifted his eyes once more, not expecting immediate forgiveness, not expecting special treatment, but hoping there was still a path forward. Marcus looked directly at him with calm compassion, then rested one hand on the leather folder before saying, "Before I announce my final investment decision, there is one question I believe every leader in this room should answer, including you, Ethan." Marcus let the question linger in the air. No one rushed to answer because everyone understood it was larger than a business exercise. He slowly looked around the ballroom before speaking again. If someone walked into your company tomorrow wearing ordinary clothes, carrying no title, and offering no introduction, how would your people treat them? His voice remained steady. Because that answer tells me more about your culture than any annual report ever could. The room fell silent once again. Ethan took a slow breath before finally speaking. They should be treated with respect, he said quietly. Marcus nodded. They should. Another pause followed. But tonight proved that ideals are easy to print in brochures and much harder to practice. Ethan lowered his head. You are right. There was no defensiveness left in his voice. No attempt to explain away the evening. I judged you before I knew anything about you. Marcus studied him carefully, searching not for polished words, but for sincerity. Richard remained still, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Olivia Bennet noticed several executives discreetly closing the presentation folders they had prepared. Suddenly, financial projections seemed secondary to the conversation taking place before them. Marcus returned to the head table and opened the leather folder one final time. He removed a single sheet marked with the Coleman Community Growth Initiative seal and held it gently between his hands. Every proposal was scored using the same standards, he explained. Financial stability, long-term vision, community impact, leadership, ethics. He looked directly at Ethan. Your company ranked exceptionally well in 3 of those categories. Hope briefly returned to Ethan's eyes before Marcus continued. Leadership and ethics received the lowest evaluation. A quiet murmur spread across the ballroom. Marcus raised one hand slightly, and the whispers disappeared almost immediately. Not because of what happened tonight, he clarified. That assessment was completed weeks ago through interviews with employees, contractors, and community partners. Ethan's expression shifted from surprise to genuine reflection. He had spent months improving revenue forecasts and expanding development plans, yet he had overlooked the experiences of the people working beneath him every day. Marcus gently placed the document back onto the table. Tonight simply confirmed what the report suggested. Richard folded his hands together and smiled faintly. That is why I asked Marcus to lead this review, he said. He sees what spreadsheets cannot measure. Marcus nodded respectfully before walking toward Ethan once more. Businesses do not fail because of one difficult day, he said. They fail when leaders stop listening long before anyone notices. Ethan met his eyes without looking away. If I have the chance, he replied, I will change that. Marcus remained silent for a moment. The ballroom waited. Even the city lights beyond the windows seemed strangely still. Finally, Marcus extended his hand. Ethan accepted it immediately, not as the confident executive who had entered the gala, but as someone willing to acknowledge his shortcomings. There was no applause, no dramatic celebration, only quiet understanding spreading across the room. Marcus released the handshake and looked toward Richard. I believe people deserve the opportunity to grow when they are willing to face the truth. Richard smiled. Then your recommendation is ready? Marcus looked once more at the investment folder, then at Ethan, before calmly answering, yes. But the future of Whitmore urban development will depend on one condition that every person in this ballroom is about to hear. Marcus picked up the investment folder and slowly closed it before looking around the ballroom one final time. Every face reflected the same quiet anticipation. Richard Coleman stepped back without saying a word, allowing Marcus to finish what he had started. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the polished table and spoke with calm conviction. Whitmore Urban Development will receive the investment. A wave of surprised whispers swept across the room before fading almost as quickly as it had begun. Ethan looked up in disbelief. Victoria stared at Marcus, unable to understand why someone they had treated so poorly would still choose to move forward. Marcus gently raised his hand, asking for patience. The funding comes with one condition, he continued. Not a financial condition, not a legal condition, a human one. The room grew silent once more. Within the next 12 months, your company will complete an independent workplace culture review. Every employee, every contractor, every support staff member will have the opportunity to share their experience without fear. The results will be reviewed before the second phase of funding is released. Ethan listened without interruption. Marcus continued, leadership is not measured by how you treat investors. It is measured by how you treat the people who believe they have nothing to offer you. Richard smiled quietly, recognizing the principle that had guided every successful partnership they had ever built together. Olivia Bennett immediately made a note in the official agreement, adding the new condition exactly as Marcus had described it. Around the ballroom, several executives exchanged thoughtful looks. More than one quietly realized that the same standard could easily be applied to their own organizations. Ethan stepped forward with genuine humility. I accept every condition, he said. Not because I need the investment, but because tonight showed me something I should have learned long ago. Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. Then make certain your employees never have to wonder whether they belong. Victoria slowly approached Marcus as well. Her voice was almost trembling. I cannot undo what happened earlier. Marcus offered a gentle smile. None of us can change yesterday. We can only decide what tomorrow looks like. She lowered her eyes, grateful that he had answered without resentment. The elderly woman Marcus had helped earlier quietly walked over from her table and touched his arm. Young man, she said softly. Thank you for reminding all of us what real dignity looks like. Marcus smiled warmly. Thank you, ma'am. The string quartet began playing again, but the music felt different now. Conversations resumed with less pride and more sincerity. Guests introduced themselves to people they had overlooked earlier in the evening. Waiters received smiles instead of hurried gestures. The ballroom had not changed, yet the people inside it had. Richard lifted his glass and looked toward Marcus with quiet admiration. Some investments build buildings, he said. The best ones build better people. Marcus looked across the room, watching strangers greet one another with simple kindness, and knew that the most valuable return on any investment could never be measured on a balance sheet. The gala slowly returned to its gentle rhythm, but nothing about the evening felt the same anymore. The crystal chandeliers still cast warm light across the ballroom. The musicians continued their elegant performance, and the Chicago skyline still shimmered beyond the towering windows. Yet every conversation now carried a different tone. People who had arrived focused on influence and recognition were leaving with something far more valuable to consider. Marcus Ellington quietly stepped away from the head table after exchanging a final handshake with Richard Coleman. He did not wait for photographers. He did not gather around the executives hoping to introduce themselves. Instead, he paused beside the elderly woman he had helped earlier in the evening. She smiled warmly and placed a gentle hand on his arm. I hope you know you changed more than one company tonight, she said. Marcus smiled with quiet gratitude. I hope we all change together. As he walked toward the ballroom entrance, several employees working the event looked up from their duties. The young valet who had greeted Marcus when he arrived straightened proudly. One of the waiters offered a sincere smile. The event coordinator, still reflecting on everything that had happened, thanked each member of her staff by name before the evening ended. Small moments, almost invisible to everyone else, quietly became the greatest evidence that lasting change had already begun. Across the ballroom, Ethan remained standing beside the reserved chair that had started everything. He gently picked up the place card bearing Marcus's name and looked at it for a long moment before carefully placing it back exactly where it belonged. He understood now that respect was never about a chair, a title, or a fortune. It was about recognizing another person's dignity before learning their accomplishments. Victoria quietly joined him. "We almost lost far more than an investment," she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. "We almost lost the opportunity to become better people." Richard Coleman watched them from across the room and allowed himself a small smile. Olivia Bennett closed the final folder of the evening and looked toward the ballroom doors where Marcus was preparing to leave. "He could have embarrassed them," she said softly. Richard shook his head. "That is why I trust him. Real leaders do not prove their strength by humiliating others. They reveal it through grace when they have every reason not to." Outside, the cool evening air welcomed Marcus as he stepped onto the quiet sidewalk. The lights of downtown Chicago reflected across the river, stretching into the distance beneath the peaceful night sky. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and began walking without looking back. Behind him, laughter gradually returned to the ballroom, but it sounded warmer now, less guarded, more human. The reserved chair remained exactly where it had always belonged, not because of the wealth attached to the name printed on the card, but because everyone who had witnessed the evening finally understood that true honor is never earned through status alone. It is earned by the way a person chooses to treat others when nobody believes they are important. And long after the flowers faded, the music ended, and the ballroom lights were switched off, those who had been present would remember one quiet man who never demanded respect, yet inspired an entire room to rediscover it.